Classified US documents leaked this week. We told you about it in detail. They laid bare many military secrets and they upset many allies of Washington. The question was, who did it? And now the Americans have an answer, and frankly, it's quite embarrassing for them. The suspect behind this leak is all of 21 years old. What's worse, he's a junior employee of the US Defense Department. All that his job role requires is a high school degree, a driver's license, and up to 18 months of training on the job. That's all. It doesn't sound like the credentials of a mastermind, does it? And this man pulled off America's biggest defense leak of the decade. Washington is going to have a hard time explaining how this happened. Here's a report.
The FBI has arrested Jack Teixeira, a 21-year-old Air National Guardsman. Federal agents came in an armored car, swooped in on him at his home in Massachusetts. The neighbors were shocked.
I think it's nuts. Nothing like this has ever happened around here. Like, this is a very small community. Everybody knows each other.
Teixeira is suspected of leaking America's classified defense documents. He could face charges under the Espionage Act, and each charge can carry up to a 10-year prison term, with each leaked document treated as a separate count in his indictment. In other words, he could be facing a very long jail sentence. But let's put this in perspective. This was the biggest US intelligence leak in a decade, and it was committed by a junior Pentagon officer. As far as the hierarchy goes, he's being called an insignificant National Guard. He shared these documents and pictures on an online chat room among friends and acquaintances, some of whom are teenagers. And this leak discloses important classified information. There are in-depth assessments of the Ukraine war and information on how the US collects its intelligence. Later, he also told his friends to delete this information and lay low. This is embarrassing for Washington, to say the least, and raises the obvious question: how safe is America's sensitive information? Can the so-called most powerful nation of the world keep a secret? For now, this is what US President Joe Biden has said.
There is a full-blown investigation going on, as you know, with the intelligence community and the Justice Department, and they're getting close.
But he has also downplayed the matter.
I'm not concerned about the leakages, and I'm concerned that it happened. But there's nothing contemporaneous that I'm aware of that is of big consequence.
As of 2019, about 3 million people had the permission to access America's classified documents. Sounds like oversharing, right? It has become protocol after the 9/11 attacks. They believe information must be spread relatively widely to avoid a similar attack in the future. But experts think this creates problems because the US loses some control. It can't keep track of who spreads what information and when. It's understandable that national security officials need to do their jobs. They need access to databases and raw information. But let's remember an important tenet in the intelligence community. Information should only be accessed by people who need to know. Need is the key word here, and it goes against laying a nation's secrets wide open, even if it's among those with security clearances. Maybe Washington is learning its lesson the hard way, because the Pentagon is under fire and tightening its circle of employees and contractors, awaiting a review of its access and procedures. The US is hoping it works because its vulnerabilities are now for the world to see.
To America now, but before I talk about my next story, let's list some of the internal problems of the US. Gun violence, police brutality, rampant racism, economic turmoil, homelessness. I could go on. But you know what America has chosen to declare war on? It's women, particularly their bodies and their agency over it. First, the facts. The state of Florida has voted to prohibit abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. It will be one of the most restrictive abortion laws, not just in the US, but in the world. Here's an example of how drastic it is. At 6 weeks, most women don't even realize that they're pregnant. Florida's existing law allows abortions up to 15 weeks of pregnancy. Just a year ago, it allowed abortions until 24 weeks of pregnancy. And what's the standard practice worldwide? Many countries allow abortion till 12 weeks on request and up to 24 weeks in cases of rape, incest, fetal impairment, and risk to the mother's life. In India, the limit is 24 weeks. Last year, in a landmark ruling, the Indian Supreme Court said that all women are entitled to a safe and legal abortion irrespective of their marital status. Now juxtapose this with what the US Supreme Court did in 2022. It overturned the landmark Roe versus Wade legislation. What is this law? It guaranteed access to abortion as a federal right in the US. It guaranteed the right to abortion to US women. The court struck it down. And with that one decision, the legal protection that women had in the US for 50 years was gone. So now each state can decide what they want. They can curb or ban abortion rights, and they're doing it. Cue Florida. This is what a Republican lawmaker in Florida said, and I'm quoting. For the past 50 years, we've had a culture grow in this nation, a culture of abortion for any reason at any time. Today, we stand for life. Now listen to what Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, said. He's a Republican presidential contender, and he said this a few days back.
This leftist agenda, the woke ideology, is a threat to our freedoms. Our bottom line is we do not surrender to the woke mob. Florida's where woke goes to die.
He's echoing what many Republicans believe, that woke is morally broke. This broadside is neither casual nor impromptu. It's an election soapbox to cater to their constituents, because the issue of abortion in America is a deeply political and divisive one. Now, just to clarify, we are no flag bearers of wokeism. Neither are we debating the political merits of Republicans or Democrats. We are asking some very fundamental questions here. Like, why is the US denying its women access to safe and legal abortion? The freedom to choose what to do with their own bodies. And Florida is not an isolated case. Last Friday, a judge in Texas revoked an FDA approval. FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. It's a regulatory authority for food and medicines in America. A Texas judge revoked its approval of a drug called mifepristone. And why is this significant? Because mifepristone is one of the 2 drugs used for medically induced abortions. Simply put, it's an abortion pill. So banning it would have far-reaching implications. But the US president and his deputy condemned the ruling.
My thoughts are it's completely out of bounds what the judge did. Thank you.
And for once, the Biden administration acted swiftly as well. They appealed to a higher court. The Texas judge's decision has been put on hold. So for now, the abortion pill remains available in the US, but with strict limitations. It's a small victory, but the big picture remains bleak for women in America. And at the heart of the debate are serious questions. Questions like, who decides for women? Do they or do lawmakers? Is procreation a personal choice or a political tool? Women having agency over their bodies, is it a fundamental right or a subversive thought? Do you know the gender of those making these critical decisions on behalf of women? Men, mostly white, middle-aged men. Most of the lawmakers who decided in Florida on the 6-week abortion ban were men. The Texas judge who banned the abortion pill, a 46-year-old white man. The tale of gendered oppression is as old as time. Former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made an impassioned speech in 1995 at a UN conference on women.
There is one message that echoes forth from this conference. Let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
It's 2023, but women in the so-called land of the free are still not free to make choices about their own bodies and, by extension, their lives. And the tragic irony is this: the US is more concerned about the unborn fetus than it is about the safety of its children. Because gatekeeping the gunmen running riot at American schools is a far tougher task than weaponizing women's bodies for political leverage. So when it comes to women, we say America is no better than the Taliban. Now to Pakistan. Guess what they're complaining about? Cross-border terrorism. Would have been funny had it not been so serious. Pakistan, of all countries, is fighting cross-border terrorism. And who are the terrorists? Pakistan's very own protégés, the Taliban. They were created and nurtured by the Pakistani state, and now they're showing that they have a mind of their own. Pakistan helped the Taliban come to power in 2021, and since then, they've been fighting. Taliban fighters have entered Pakistan. They've launched terror attacks. There has been friction at the border, and Islamabad is looking helpless, unable to rein in the beast they created. So now Pakistan's defense minister has issued a warning, and it seems he's taking inspiration from India. Khwaja Asif is threatening to conduct surgical strikes. Not making this up. Listen to this, and I'm quoting from what he said. This is Khwaja Asif, the defense minister of Pakistan. He says, if that is not done, at some point we'll have to resort to some measures which will definitely, wherever terrorists are, their sanctuaries on Afghan soil, we'll have to hit them. We'll have to hit them because we cannot tolerate the situation for long. I know it's hard to process. This country is a terror state, the headquarters of global terrorism, the pioneers of cross-border terrorism. If there's one thing they've done consistently since the formation of Pakistan, it is launching terror attacks against India. And now the same Pakistan is complaining about another neighbor. You know what they say? What goes around comes around. So Khwaja Asif, the defense minister of Pakistan, is warning the Taliban leadership. Apparently they made some promises, but they failed to keep them. After all, they've learned from Pakistan, and evidently they've learned well. Reports say they were asked for two things. Number one, stop supporting anti-Pak terrorists. And number two, stop terror attacks from Afghan soil. Irony died 1,000 deaths here. Pakistan is telling a terror group it created to stop terrorist attacks. Khwaja Asif's interview has some great material for stand-up comics. Although what's happening in Pakistan is no laughing matter, they don't pull the strings in Kabul anymore. And one of Kabul's closest allies is targeting them. Pakistan's biggest headache right now is a group called the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, also known as the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP. They are the ones fomenting trouble. In December last year, the TTP had 7,000 to 10,000 fighters in and around Pakistan's border with Afghanistan. This group is gaining influence in areas like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, South Waziristan and North Waziristan. In November 2021, a ceasefire was secured, a ceasefire between Pakistan and the TTP, and reports say the Taliban in Kabul brokered the ceasefire. But last year, this deal collapsed. The TTP and its affiliates stepped up attacks. They began striking inside Pakistan. In 2022, they conducted at least 367 attacks. 367 attacks in a year, that's more than one attack a day. And they've been targeting Pakistani security forces. Going by one report, the TTP has taken the lives of hundreds of Pakistani cops and soldiers. Pakistan is facing a full-blown insurgency. The situation at the border is tense. And this is a landlocked border, the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It has 18 main crossing points, 18 checkpoints. Out of these, two are the biggest and the busiest, the Torkham and the Chaman border posts. These two are the busiest. And recently, both of them witnessed clashes. In December last year, at least 6 Pakistanis were killed in firing. And in February this year, there was a firing incident at the Torkham post. This was after a unilateral action from the Taliban. They suddenly decided to shut down the border crossing. Why did they do it? It was an act of retaliation. Apparently, Pakistan had blocked the entry of an Afghan patient's attendant. And the Taliban hit back at Islamabad. It says Pakistan is, quote-unquote, not honoring its commitments. So there is anger on both sides. The Taliban is upset with Pakistan. It doesn't like being told what to do. And Pakistan is coming to terms with the fact that the Taliban will behave like the Taliban with everyone. It wants something to be done about the terrorists, or it will explore military options, it says. And if history is anything to go by, this won't end well. Meanwhile, Pakistan's iron brother China is up to its old games. The Muslim holy month of Ramadan is on, and a new report on Chinese Muslims is out. These are the Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province. They're among the most persecuted people in the world, and our reports say they're not being allowed to fast during Ramadan. Of course, Pakistan is not complaining or condemning this. Neither is any other Islamic nation. They only want to champion the cause of Indian Muslims. Ramadan or not, they will not question China. But we'll tell you what's going on. Quick primer first. Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group. Some of them reside in Central Asian countries, but most of them come from China's northwestern province of Xinjiang. It's home to over 10 million Uyghurs. They make up less than 1% of China's total population, but they're almost half of the population of the Xinjiang province. Over the last few years, these people have been under attack, constant attack by the Chinese state. More than 1 million of them have been jailed. There are reports of forced labor and state-sanctioned rape. Uyghurs live under severe restrictions and surveillance. And now they're not being allowed to pray during Ramadan, to fast during Ramadan. Reports say China has sent spies into Uyghur villages to enforce this. Beijing calls them ears. And these spies or ears are mostly Uyghurs. China uses them to oppress their own people. What do? These spies bring reports of fasting to the Chinese authorities, and those found observing the Ramadan fast are rounded up. It's a flagrant violation of human rights, and sadly, it's not new. No one seems to be doing very much about it. Once in a while, Western agencies and leaders bring it up. As we speak, the German foreign minister is in Beijing. This is what she said earlier today.
Since respect for human rights is also in our economic interest, I explained to my colleague in our bilateral talks that we are concerned that the scope for civil society engagement in China is shrinking. Human rights are being curtailed. What this means for Uyghurs is documented in black and white in the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
The UN Human Rights Commission released a report last year. It talked about mass arbitrary detentions, torture, cultural persecution, family separations, forced labor, and sexual violence. And this has been going on for years. Beijing has been going after Uyghurs since at least 2017. That's when China began rounding up Uyghurs and putting them into concentration camps. China calls them re-education and training camps. It says people were sent there to these camps to prevent radicalization. But those who survive and escape have horror stories to tell. Here's one such.
On 1st of April 2017, all women detainees were chained onto the bed. I was chained to the bed for 20 days. The first they shackled my feet and then they detained. The women's condition in the detention centers are horrible. All women are shackled and our language of Uyghur will prohibit to speak.
Does that sound like re-education and training to you? A former Human Rights Watch chief described the situation like this.
So, for example, even today in the Xinjiang region of China, where the Chinese government is detaining, 1 million Uyghur Muslims to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, and their language. That's, one of the biggest crimes against humanity being committed today.
Forced to abandon their religion, culture, and language, he says. The camp survivor earlier said she was not allowed to speak her language. And now reports say they're not being allowed to fast during Ramadan. If this isn't cultural genocide, I don't know what is. The Chinese are killing the Uyghur identity. The dominant ethnic group in China is called the Han Chinese. The Uyghurs are being forced to assimilate, to adopt the dominant Han Chinese way of life. Beijing, of course, denies all of this. And this is not the first time Uyghurs are being barred from fasting during Ramadan. Similar reports have come out in the past. They came out 2 years ago. Those under 65 years of age were not allowed to fast then. This time, apparently, there's a blanket ban. But who will question China? World leaders are busy propping it up as a peacemaker. There are leaders who wax eloquent about human rights. But when it comes to the Chinese state, they pretend that none of it is happening. Now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with North Korea. They tested a new solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile. It's called the Hwasong-18. The test aims to radically promote North Korea's nuclear counterattack capability. In France, protests against President Macron's pension reforms continue. Fresh clashes erupted between police and protesters in Paris. Meanwhile, a bridge collapsed in the western part of Colombia. 2 police officials have lost their lives. In Afghanistan, lack of infrastructure is making it difficult for teachers to reach schools. And finally, what happened today in history? The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw from Afghanistan. The year was 1988. It had been 9 years since the USSR entered Afghanistan. Their aim was to establish a pro-Soviet regime in Kabul, but they faced resistance. It led to heavy Russian casualties. Eventually, the cost of the conflict shot up so much that the Soviet Union decided it would pull out its forces from Afghanistan. In exchange, the United States agreed to stop sending arms to Afghanistan. Around 1 million civilians were killed in this conflict. Leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.
Ils sont retraits. Oh là là.
Uy, Dios mío.
Bendito sea el Señor. Señor bendito.
советских людей, всей мировой общественности.
The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.